I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, as Ukraine hits a Russian naval base on the Caspian Sea and North Korean troops enter combat for the first time, we examine the fallout from the US presidential election and ask, is Donald Trump the best thing that's ever happened to NATO?
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 6th of November, 2 years and 262 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined in the London office by assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley and Dr. Dalibor Rohac of the American Enterprise Institute, and live from Washington DC, former and potentially future politician Adam Kinzinger. I started with the latest news from the battlefield. The first North Korean forces have likely engaged in combat against Ukrainian troops in Kursk Oblast. This comes from Ukraine's Defense Minister Rustem Umerov in an interview with South Korean national broadcaster KBS yesterday. He said Ukrainian forces engaged in what he called small-scale clashes with North Korean troops in Kursk Oblast, but emphasised that it will take more time for the entire contingent of North Korean forces to deploy to enter combat. Mr. Umerov said it would be difficult to quickly ascertain North Korean casualty figures as Pyongyang's troops have been mixed in with the Russian army and are disguised as soldiers from the Republic of Buryatia. That's the Russian region just north of Mongolia. Institute for the Study of War, the US-based think tank, say this is likely because Russia is trying to integrate North Korean troops into the Russian force structure as opposed to maintaining separate North Korean units fighting under Russian command. Just on the North Korean troops, I note comments by Gideon Rachman, who's the foreign affairs commentator at the Financial Times. He said on Twitter yesterday, quote, "A usually reliable source tells me that the North Korean soldiers who have deployed to Russia have never had unfettered access to the internet before. As a result, they are gorging on pornography. Say, just give them all Starlinks and let them exhaust themselves with physical narcissism." Anyway, next one. Ukraine's military intelligence was behind a drone attack on a Russian naval base in the city of Caspian. That's in Russia's Dagestan Republic, over on the Caspian Sea. A source was speaking to the Kyiv Independent. They're reporting it today. Now, at least two vessels, the missile ships Tatarstan and Dagestan, were said to have been damaged in the attack, and possibly also several other small Project 21631 ships. Now, they are missile-firing corvettes designed to operate in the littoral. The littoral is the area, in military terms, where the sea meets the land. So they're not cut out for the big blue wobbly stuff, but they are better off in kind of inshore waters, rivers, that kind of thing. Now, the Dagestan authorities said they'd intercepted a drone over the city. This is about 1,000 k's from the front line. Drone apparently hit this morning. They say they intercepted it, but something's got through. There is footage showing something landing, and the nearby Machakala airport, which is about 15 k's away, has had to suspend operations. So something got through. On the ground in Ukraine and Kursk in Russia, very little movement. The Russian main effort is still pushing north of Vuhledar in the Donbass. They're trying to close the salient that has emerged as the Russian push further north from Vuhledar meets the efforts they're trying to do pushing southwest from that bulge that's in front of Pokrovsk and west out of Donetsk city. So they're trying to close that salient there. And a couple more from me. Denis Shmyhal, Prime Minister of Ukraine, thanked Chrystia Freeland. She's Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance of Canada. He also thanked the Canadian people yesterday after Canada said it will provide Ukraine with 5 billion Canadian dollars. That's about 3.7 billion US dollars from frozen Russian assets as part of that G7 initiative that we've spoken of in the past. Canada was the first country to advocate the use of these funds to support Ukraine. So it's good that it's working. Now, on to The election, yesterday's election, and the result just a few hours ago. President Zelensky has sent his congratulations to Donald Trump for his, quote, impressive election victory, exclamation mark. I think that's a good, interesting use of the exclamation mark there, channeling Donald Trump's style of communication, lots of sort of words and what have you that would chime with Mr. Trump, I think. President Zelensky said he recalled the great meeting he had with Donald Trump back in September, again, channeling the language, when they discussed in detail the Ukraine-US strategic partnership, President Zelensky's victory plans and ways to, as he say, put an end to Russian aggression against Ukraine. So President Zelensky said, I appreciate President Trump's commitment to the peace through strength approach in global affairs. Again, listen to the language, peace through strength. He's trying to push all the right buttons. I appreciate through global affairs. This is exactly the principle that can practically bring just peace in Ukraine closer. I'm hopeful that we will put it into action together. We look forward to an era of a strong United States of America under President Trump's decisive leadership, pushing all the right buttons. We rely on continued strong bipartisan support for Ukraine in the United States. He then went on, he appealed to Mr. Trump's business instincts. He said, we are interested in developing mutually beneficial political and economic cooperation that will benefit both of our nations. Ukraine, as one of Europe's strongest military powers, is committed to ensuring long-term peace and security in Europe and the transatlantic community with the support of our allies. I'm looking forward to personally congratulating President Trump and discussing ways to strengthen Ukraine's strategic partnership with the United States. So, as you'd expect, but I thought the use of language there was very interesting in places. Now, on Donald Trump's claim to end the war in Ukraine in a day, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said this morning, we have repeatedly said that the United States can help end the conflict in Ukraine. This, of course, cannot be done overnight. Okay. He also said Putin does not plan to congratulate Trump on his victory as the US is an unfriendly country involved in a war against Russia. Poor little Russia. I'm not sure where this war is, but maybe Francis can shed some light. Francis, got any ideas on that? And what else has caught your eye in the aftermath of last night's election result?
Well, thanks, Dom. Putin may well rue that, I think, knowing Trump's personality. As you say, Trump has not only won the presidential election, he's won it decisively, projected to sweep through the swing states of North Carolina, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin and Michigan in a landslide, and is also on course to become the first Republican to win the popular vote since George W. Bush in 2004. This is not the place to dedicate too much time to why it happened, rather its ramifications for the defence theatre, and I can't wait to hear what our distinguished guests have to offer on that later. But as regular listeners will probably have gauged, watching this from across the pond, there were many of us who thought this was the most likely outcome for several reasons. The Democrats had one job when they narrowly won in 2020, to prepare a candidate who could beat Trump in 2024, as it should have been obvious that Biden's age made him a one-term president. Instead, we were told for years that Biden's age wasn't an issue when it was clear for anyone to see, and who saw Biden speaking up close, as I did twice, that he was too doddery, frankly, to contest, let alone win, another election. By the time the Democrats had a similar revelation, it was too late to build up a new candidate from scratch, so the party opted for Harris, an unpopular vice president of an already unpopular incumbent party. And not only that, but a candidate who, for historical reasons, faced an uphill battle due to her identity and background, a mixed-race woman from California. It was a bad political choice for the zeitgeist, and she played a bad hand badly, not engaging with journalists in long-form interviews, her rather bizarre delivery, and her policy platform, especially on the economy, at a time when many people felt worse than they did 4 years ago. Now, I know it's very easy to say all this in retrospect, but I actually wrote what I just said last week as part of our predictions here at the paper. I only offer it here to stir your reflections, especially in the United States, and to offer the perspective from those of us watching in Europe. For geopolitics, of course, the current understanding is that there are two likely outcomes now. As we've discussed many times in recent months, for some, it will see a hardening of Trump's America First policy, leading to withdrawal of support for Ukraine in an attempt to force that country to the negotiating table. Trump has made it clear he sees the war in Ukraine as an expensive inconvenience that America is essentially funding alone, with Europe fleecing the American taxpayer. This is a powerful line because it is true in its essence, if not in the details. The US has funded Ukraine far more than any other power, which is absurd, given that this is fundamentally a European conflict in terms of the peoples most directly threatened. Trump and his advisors are more focused on China and see Ukraine as a distraction from the Pacific theatre. In that scenario, Europe and the West beyond the US now has 2 months before Trump's inauguration to prepare for the eventuality of American withdrawal of support, perhaps even a weakening of America's pivotal role in NATO. Due to European failures to arm or majorly ramp up its factories to arm itself and Kyiv, Western leaders will have no choice now but to get creative if they choose that path. Europe cannot replicate US military support, but it can narrow the gap by buying US arms already built in the short term and finding collaborative ways to scale up production in the medium term. The requested weapons permissions could also be granted to the Ukrainians to enable them to strike deeper inside Russia. Likewise, red lines in Ukraine could also be articulated by European powers, as could security guarantees with or without some kind of peace deal. All of this, though, assumes that Europe is serious about Ukraine's victory, as opposed to what Ukrainians and Western leaders, by their own metrics, not ours, would consider a bad peace. There is room for optimism in that scenario, that no longer will Ukraine face a continuity Biden administration, indecisive and predictable, leading to the slow weakening of Kyiv's position. We might also see other Western powers finally stir from their slumbers. Similarly, and this is the other scenario, perhaps Trump will surprise us. He is a changeable personality, after all, and he may not want his first foreign policy decision to see an American defeat, as Afghanistan was seen by many when Biden conducted the withdrawal there the way he did. This would be the Boris Johnson argument. Perhaps, too, the unpredictability in the White House will lead to the West's enemies thinking twice about what they do. He may be more robust in the Middle East and against China. But from what we've seen in this campaign, that would be quite a deviation. It'll be really interesting to hear our guest perspectives on that. But for now, the enemies of Ukraine seem pretty cock-a-hoop, frankly. As Dmitry Medvedev put it this morning, Kamala is finished. Let her keep cackling infectiously. The objectives of the special military operation remain unchanged and will be achieved. Now, I should add also that there were bomb threats made last night to several polling stations in the United States that were said to have originated from Russia, which temporarily closed polling stations in Atlanta and elsewhere. We don't know if those were lone wolves or state-sanctioned, but they feel irrelevant now given the result. But nonetheless, they wouldn't have been irrelevant if this had been going the other way, I would argue. All the while, and I'm wrapping up now, in what may be deemed an appropriate metaphor, as the election results trickled through last night, warning sirens sounded over Kyiv, waking the population up to a result that was unfolding 10,000 kilometres away. The Ukrainians have never been complacent as to the reality that faces them, but Europe as a whole has been. One has to wonder whether now, at last, is the moment Europe too wakes up to the danger confronting it.
Thank you, Francis. Neatly introduces, there you go, put my teeth back in, the themes that we're going to be dealing with over the next 4 years, I guess. And so with that in mind, delighted now to welcome back to the pod our friend Adam Kinzinger. Adam, I don't know if you got up early for this or you've had to stay up all night. Delighted. Maybe we'll be able to tell from the slurring of your voice, perhaps. But Adam, you were Republican Congressman for districts in Illinois between 2011 and 2023. You've worn the uniform, former Lieutenant Colonel in the Air National Guard. So welcome back to the pod. So as we just heard there from the F-bomb, the Republican Party has taken the Senate, where a third of the seats were up for grabs last night. They may also control Congress. After all, 435 seats have been voted for. The last I checked, about 10 minutes ago, it was 198 to the Republicans, 180 Democrat. Obviously, 218 needed to take control there. Adam, with words that could have been written with Donald Trump in mind. One of my favorite columnists and journalists, the US self-declared Republican Party reptile, P.J. O'Rourke, said in one of his book, his 1991 book, Parliament of Whores, which I very much enjoyed, he said, giving money and power to government is like giving whiskey and car keys to teenage boys. Now, the Republican Party, as I say, got a huge amount of power, or rather Donald Trump now has a huge amount of power. Has he just been given all the whiskey and car keys that he would want, Adam? What's your reaction? Welcome back.
Yeah, thanks. Good to be back with you. And no, look, I went to bed last night when I saw the writing on the wall, and I had really sad dreams. It was, I usually don't have bad dreams, but last night they were sad. It was really odd. So it was like kind of real life into my sleeping. But yeah, I mean, look, I think it's last time I was part of this not the administration, but I was a Republican when Donald Trump won in 2016 and we took the House and the Senate. At that point, we had pretty mature leaders. I mean, we were able to do tax reform, which I actually think the tax reform bill was good in terms of things it did for bringing business to the U.S. And we wanted to fix the healthcare system. But now, look, if you look at like the House and the Senate, at what's there, I mean, they're not talking about things like comprehensive tax reform or whatever. The thing they're discussing is stuff like mass deportations, border stuff. And it's going to be very interesting because one of the things we've seen is Hispanic voters went actually almost in many states, they actually went a majority for Republicans. And I'd be happy to get into why I think last night was a shellacking. But I will say I have a lot of anger right now to the current president, to President Biden on Ukraine, both his inability to actually give Ukraine a winning hand, this idea of escalation. We have to stay away from escalation. So now we're almost 3 years into this war. And unfortunately, a new president can come along and change that, as well as, again, as Francis, who I think gave a very amazing, frankly, synopsis of what happened and why. But I think his decision to wait until June or July made Kamala an unknown factor, and she was just unable to get out there and introduce herself. But wherever you want to take this, I'm happy to chat about it. It's a sad day for a lot of us. But look, I think, we go through this in the 250 years of American history. People have elected presidents we didn't like, and usually half of the country is upset about it. And somehow we've always survived. We've always made it through. And somehow we've even seemed to be getting stronger over time. So I hope this is no exception, just for our country's sake.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have both worn uniform. I stood shoulder to shoulder with my colleagues and brothers in the US forces on 9/11 on operations in the Balkans. So I have been wondering for some time actually where my friend has gone. My friend America. I've got a deep love of America, but just recently I wonder if my friend's not gone away, but I just sort of wondering what they're doing over there in this shed, wandering around and all that kind of stuff. So I hope this is a chance for there's some of the dithering over the last few years to be done with, because they're great men and women in the US forces. I've worked with them. And I know.
I hope your friend is just kind of in a coke bender right now, and we got to get clean. We got to get him into rehab. It may take a couple of years, but we'll get there. And by the way, I'll just say on that, I agree with you, because I worked with British forces in Iraq and out of Balad, SAS, as well as some of the British aviation units. And you guys are the best. And you supplied us with alcohol, so I appreciate that, because we couldn't have it.
Well, yeah, this isn't going to turn into a bro fest, but I've got to say, one of my best quotes from my tour in Afghanistan, we were commanded by a US general, and he commanded all the aviation in southwestern Afghanistan. And he said to us, he said, "You Brits fly your helicopters like you stole them." I'll take that. That's brilliant. Anyway, enough of this. Adam, so last Trump presidency, there was huge amount of foot dragging from European politicians. A lot of chat, really bad chat about, once he gets in, the weight of responsibility is going to change him. There are grown-ups in the room, Jim Mattis, etc. Let's just wait a couple of years. They all did very little action. There's no excuse this time. They know what to expect. They know what's coming down the tracks. This is the time for real leaders to step up. So do you think actually Donald Trump is the best thing that's ever happened to NATO?
Look, no, but let's take that thread, because I think you're very right. Look, at the him-hawing that's going to happen, and the people that are like, "Oh, America sucks now." And look, I mean, it's every time, no matter who we elect as president. When we elected George W. Bush, Europe was really ticked off at us. In hindsight, George W. Bush was a pretty good dude. So, but yeah, I mean, we'll take that thread and say, okay, here's the best case scenario. The best case scenario is, Donald Trump kind of wants to get his deal. He says, look, Europe has to step up, which we all know is true. And Francis did a good job, and you have done a good job also of talking about that it is time for Europe to step up. I mean, the fact that, some countries can't put a combat brigade basically in theater if they needed to. Even just over this last week, we're listening to the Germans, talk about whether or not we need Finlandization of Ukraine. And yet when the U.S. has a little bit of whipsaw, the world freaks out. But then Germany can come along and whipsaw. And it's like, oh, okay, well, at least we have the U.S. No, it is time for Europe to step up, take accountability and responsibility for their own theater, and hopefully we'll be there to help them. I mean, I certainly hope so. I want the U.S. to be a big part of NATO. And so the possibility is that, yes, this kind of forces Europe to come to a decision. Do they really want NATO? And if they do, they're going to have to step up with everything we know, from weapons production to industrial capacity, et cetera. But I also I think the reality is there is a chance that I don't think NATO will fall apart, but it could be reduced in its meaningfulness. I don't think Donald Trump is out there saying things he doesn't mean. This guy has really kind of lost his mind, and he doesn't understand foreign policy. To him, everything is, how does it affect him? It's not even, how does it affect the United States of America? And so foreign leaders have got to understand that and then try to operate within that context, similar to how, Zelensky's quote today seemed to play to that, which is what needs to happen. But yeah, I mean, and I also want to say for the Biden administration, look, again, I'm very bitter at the Biden administration, both for, the pullout of Afghanistan, because that is when the bubble popped, really. That's when Joe Biden went underwater with popularity and never came back up, because it was kind of this era of invincibility that blew out. But also with the fact that they're still sitting on billions of dollars of aid that people like me, when I was in Congress and out, fought really hard for, despite our national debt, to get that aid over to Ukraine, to give Ukraine the tools that they needed. We have like 2,000 Abrams tanks sitting in storage, rotting away in case there's World War III, and we can't give those to Ukraine. We've held back on the F-16s. One of these countries has a new jet they wanted to send to Ukraine that the United States has said no on, and then long-range strike capability. I mean, we could have had this war over if we'd have given Ukraine what they needed in the first year, including a no-fly zone over Ukraine, which makes total sense. We did this over Israel. So yeah, that's a long answer to your question, but Europe is going to have to step up because Donald Trump is, I think, frankly, pretty crazy. And you have to recognize that and operate in that context.
Yeah, Europe will have to step up. I'll ask you a question in a moment about comments this morning by Radek Sikorski, Minister of Foreign Affairs for Poland. But your point there about Trump seeing the thing about how does it affect him, I think that is very interesting, because we know he's relatively cool on support for Ukraine. I think that's putting it mildly. But it's different now. And if somebody sensible can leave the thought in his mind that in terms of legacy and what's going to be thought about you, Big Don, or whatever you call him, if you link Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, that is an axis. They are working together in a way they really didn't do last time. And if somebody says to him, look, you can save the world, you can save the planet, you can smash this ring, this, as you've described, as it's been described, this axis of evil, you can do it. You can break these guys apart, and that would be your legacy. That then might get some cut through. I agree with you. Folks like Olaf Scholz, German Chancellor right now, extremely vulnerable, especially with his daft comments last week or earlier this week. God, things are moving fast. About Finlandization, this idea that Ukraine should be neutral. I mean, Finland was neutral, and then guess what? It joined NATO because of the crazy stuff going on next door. So I know some folk worry that Donald Trump will remove the US from NATO. I think that's unlikely. I'll be very interested if you think that. But perhaps more likely, but potentially just as damaging, what do you think are the chances that Donald Trump will remove the US from NATO's military command? This might be spinning on detail here, but the French removed themselves from the military command. They're there for the politics and stick the flag on the poster kind of thing, but they're not going to put troops in the way. Back in testing my knowledge here, 60s was it? Anyway, they're back in the military command. But what if the US withdrew from the military command? That would fundamentally damage the alliance, I suggest. Any chance of that? What do you reckon?
Yeah, I think no. I mean, yeah, there's really anything. If somebody offends Trump, like, yeah, he'll nuke somebody over being offended. Not really, but that's kind of his personality. So no, I don't think that you're going to see the U.S. remove itself from the military command. I don't think you're really going to. I mean, this is me being a little optimistic. I don't think you're going to see the U.S. necessarily walk away from NATO. Here's the interesting point. I think so many. First off, still about half Republicans support Ukraine, and almost all Democrats. Unfortunately, Ukraine became a kind of partisan issue, which in the past the U.S. was exempt from having foreign policy being a partisan issue, but it is now. And I think there were some knee-jerk opposition to Ukraine only because Joe Biden supported Ukraine. And so you have some people that anything Joe Biden supports, we oppose. Now that Donald Trump is walking into that position, I mean, look, I think it's much more likely that unfortunately there will be a negotiated solution to this in terms that's probably a little less favorable to Ukraine. That's probably most likely. But it is possible he wants to act like a hawk on China. The reality, and I've sat in the Oval Office where he begged a group of about 10 of us to take China's ZTE off a sanction list because President Xi called him and asked him personally if he would do that, and he wants to do it as a favor. So I want to be clear, this is not a president that really does stand up to bad people. He just wants to be liked, and he wants people to like him. But there is this possibility that once he gets in there, it's like, look, your legacy can start out with a collapse of Ukraine if you want, or else you can negotiate a decent solution, give Ukraine what they need. So that is possible. If I was living in Ukraine right now, I'd be pretty sad today. I wouldn't be despondent. I wouldn't be hopeless. If I was sitting in Brussels with NATO, I wouldn't be at all despondent that the U.S. is going to walk away. But I do think that if I'm a leader of a NATO country that has not been paying its fair share and has not been doing enough, yeah, I'm going to be a little worried that I'm going to actually have to maybe go into deficit spending. We go into deficit spending every year. I don't necessarily encourage deficit spending, but at a time when, frankly, the free world is at risk, you might have to do a little of that.
Yeah. Now, last one for me, if I may, Adam, and you're holding up really well. I think you did get some hours sleep last night, but well done. Last one for me, because I know the F-bomb's twitching to get in. Radek Sikorski, as I say, Minister of Foreign Affairs for Poland, he said this morning after the Trump victory, he said, the American people have voted. I'm in regular contact with top security officials from both parties. Europe urgently needs to take more responsibility for its security. Bing! The winds of history are blowing ever more strongly. Poland's leadership will rise to the occasion. Poland has absolutely... Sorry, that's the end of the quote. This is me now ranting. Poland has absolutely stepped up in the last few years, massively upgunning its armed forces. Big deal with South Korea on tanks. Poland's just one of Central and Eastern Europe states, the Baltic states, Scandinavian states as well. They are really stepping up because of their recent history and because of the geography, and they can see what's going on here. Now, do you think that Poland, the Baltic states more broadly, Scandies, do you think they will be seen as a more reliable security partner than the old Europe? Remember, old Rumsfeld was going on about old Europe and new Europe. Basically, France, Germany, Spain, maybe the Brits to a certain degree, Italy. Are we finished? Are we the old Europe and we're just fluffing around and spending all our cash on whatever? And Central and Eastern Europe is spending it on hard, heavy metal. Are they a more reliable security partnership?
I hate to say this, but probably, yeah. And, I feel bad for the old Europe thing because I thought it was funny back in 2003, and now I'm like, that was kind of mean, But anyway, maybe France deserves it, but you guys stood pretty strong with us too. But no, look, I think, and this is a real question. And by the way, I meant to say this. One of the best allies for Ukraine through the Trump administration is going to be Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson is very close to Donald Trump, and Boris Johnson is a very intense Ukraine supporter. And so I think he can be a key to keeping Trump at least as much, away from me, let's pull everything away from Ukraine and let it collapse position as possible. The other question now is going to be, okay, if people like Germany continue to resist and talk about the neutrality for Ukraine and continue to be a pretty bad partner and probably are sniffing out potential business opportunities with Russia. And by the way, I don't understand this. Russia has lost 700,000 people in 3 years. This is a paltry military. This is an awful military. This is a failing country. And yet somehow there are still these people that are scared of it. It is unbelievable to me, by the way. I mean, we lost, 10,000 people throughout the entire war on terror, and that is seen as a failure. They lose 10,000 people every couple days, and somehow we're scared that the Russians are gonna win. I don't get it. But anyway, I think the question is going to be, is there going to be a coalition of the willing that goes into Ukraine? You know, people like Poland, the Baltic states, anybody else that wants to jump in, you know, putting in both trainers into Ukraine. I've always wondered how come, you know, what is to stop other countries from holding, for instance, the border with Belarus, freeing up Ukrainian troops to go east, like holding those positions as kind of a tripwire. And that may be what happens, because if it's really a question between Ukraine falls or you have a coalition of the willing, we could see that potentially happen. And by the way, that's also, we talk about, you know, what scenarios lead to massive war. That is actually a little closer than if the whole Western world stands together and gives Ukraine everything it needs.
Adam, it's Francis here. Thank you so much for your time. Welcome back. Always a pleasure to have you. You know the Republican family, as you say, and I wonder if you can comment on the radicalization of the Trump wing of the party in the past 4 years. There is a case that had he won in 2020, then we would have seen a very different version of Trump in his second term than the one we now face, given the fact that it seems that many of the people around him, you know, have in a sense seen the last election as being stolen, and there's all of these perspectives now that seem far more extreme than Trump 1.0. But what's your perspective on the ideological changes within the Trump camp that we've seen and the potential implications of that for defense and on other issues?
Yeah, look, I think that's very astute and 100% true. I mean, I guess if we could go back in time and say, okay, we have a decision between Trump wins here in 2024 again, or he wins re-election in 2020, probably better for him to have won re-election. Of course, you obviously have no idea with each election that comes up. But look, I think what you're seeing is a phenomenon you're seeing, frankly, around the world. You see it in the UK. You're seeing it in the rise of some of these right-wing movements around Europe, which is, okay, the left, you know, the left for a long time has really had this, and I feel this as like, you know, I'm a disaffected Republican, so I'm actually closer to Democrats now, of course, than Republicans, but I still hold all my old values. I still believe the things I believe. And there is a real feeling, particularly in the rural areas, that the cities or the coasts, you know, the east and west coast of the United States, don't pay attention, don't care about them. Trump comes along. You know, we used to have leaders that would come along and use fear a little bit to get your vote, but they also recognize the power of fear and wouldn't stoke that fire too much. Donald Trump doesn't care. He'll stoke the fire out of control. And that's what's happened. There's a lot of resentment, a lot of anger. And let's just be clear, and this is going to make some people upset, but there are things like telling Americans that they have to accept science on climate change, which, by the way, I do, and most Americans do. But then at the same breath saying there is infinite genders and you can be whatever gender you want to be. Well, there's a lot of people, and trust me, I've heard from them, that are like, you can't tell me to accept science on one thing and then tell me we can make up science on another. It doesn't mean in America you can't be what you want to be. Of course you can. But the question is, are you going to force somebody to say you have to recognize that reality? Now, you can disagree with that, and I don't even know my feeling on it fully, but that has created a lot of backlash. And the reason Donald Trump won so big was not because of Ukraine. Ukraine, I'm sorry, it really had nothing to do with what happened. It is all a cultural backlash against what is seen as arrogance of the ruling class, the governing class. And lastly, I'll say this. There's a big problem with men under the age of 25 and men in general for Democrats. Now, I can tell you quickly why that is. For the last 10 years, men were told that everything masculine was toxic. You remember that term, toxic masculinity, right? And there, particularly in the young generation, became this resentment. What is my role in the world? I'm told that masculinity is toxic, but I feel this desire to go fight for something, to do whatever. And in the absence of a good definition of masculinity, you know, I think true masculinity is fighting for somebody. It's punching up, right? It's defending the defenseless. But with a vacuum of that explanation, Donald Trump comes along and people like, you know, Andrew Tate, and present this version of masculinity that in the absence of anything else attracts young men particularly to it. And I think that's why you saw the under 25-year-old men go largely for Donald Trump. In the state of Wisconsin, under 30 split evenly for Trump and Harris. And that to me is unbelievable. So maybe a long answer there, but it's some of the things I think that have fed into this backlash.
No, it's really interesting and a fascinating perspective. And of course, one of the articulators of that anger is J.D. Vance. And that's my last question to you, Adam, which is what's J.D. Vance's role in all this? And what do you think his role is going to be in the Trump administration? Usually VPs are in the background, but one gets a sense that given his importance in this campaign and his articulacy on various issues, that we're going to see him far more prominently. I wonder if you can comment on him and whether you've ever had any interactions with him.
Yeah, I have had some interactions, but look, I'll say this: it depends. It's not a typical time, so it depends on Donald Trump. Donald Trump does not like to be outshined and outshined, whatever that word is. And and Mike Pence, for instance, if you saw him as vice president, his whole shtick was to talk about how amazing Donald Trump was, to be a very soft smile and say he's just honored to work for Donald Trump. And that's why, until he failed to overthrow an election, Mike Pence survived as vice president. Can J.D. Vance do that? And that's a question. Like, if he ends up trying to be this kind of, dynamic voice, which, let's be honest, he's very articulate, he may tick off Donald Trump and you may see some consternation there. But the other big question is this, what we've seen in Donald Trump's speech patterns and everything else does kind of look like there may be some cognitive decline there. I know Joe Biden got the reputation of cognitive decline, probably well earned, but it'll be interesting to see what's happening to Donald Trump. That could make J.D. Vance's, frankly, position much more important. So I think we don't know until we know. My hope is he kind of fades into the background, because I think he is a pretty detrimental figure and probably more nationalistic, more able to kind of stir those passions than even Donald Trump has been. Donald Trump's uniquely, he can uniquely convince people of things, but I do fear that J.D. Vance is kind of the next generation of that. But look, let me say this too, and this is important. I do not believe that this movement, this kind of anger, whatever, survives past this 4 years. And I know 4 years feels like a long time. I'm 46. I've been through a number of presidential elections. I'll be 50 when this is done, but it feels like it's forever. And there are some very important things up in front of us, including and especially Ukraine. But very rarely does a movement like this, does anger like this, does emotion like this survive through that 4 years, which means there's a good chance for a sane Republican, because Donald Trump can't run again, a good chance for a sane Republican or a centrist type Democrat to win in 4 years. And what we have to do is, make sure we minimize the damage to that time and fix real problems that exist, like the border and other things.
Lovely. Thanks, Adam. Please do stick around if you so wish. We're going to be here for another few minutes. Welcome your final thoughts at the end. And I wouldn't worry about turning 50. 50 is the new 17 as far as I'm concerned. And if you look at the title of today's space, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. But anyway, delighted now to turn to Dalibor Rohac, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, specialist on European political and economic trends, and one of the hosts of the Eastern Front podcast. Sorry, I'm just skipping through some of the very extensive notes that Francis prepared for me here. Dalibor, very, very pleased to welcome you to the pod and see you over here. I didn't meet you when we took the pod over to the States last year. You met Francis and our dear David. So I didn't get to say hello. I was zipping around in Colorado, or God knows where I was. So thank you very much for coming on the pod again today. You've been listening to everything that we've said today, and you're able to put it into a longer view. Any of the trends that we talked about today and that Adam was talking about, was there a certain inevitability to this, do you think, or is this completely blindsided Europe? Is there any other time post Second World War when Europe's been faced with a moment like this, when it really has to choose which way it wants to go? Welcome, Dalibor.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's great to be back on the podcast, and I'm thrilled to be in the conversation again with Adam Kinzinger, who might not remember me, but back in 2020, I did testify for the Eurasia Subcommittee on the European Green Deal and the Recovery and Resilience Facility, so it feels like a much more peaceful and more quaint era. It's great to be back and reconnected in this more casual platform. I mean, to answer your question, I think it's there's no way around the fact that this election is a blow to European security. I mean, just look at the people who are rejoicing, whether it's Medvedev or Viktor Orban. It is a blow to European security, partly because of who Trump is and how he thinks about alliances and what sort of intellectual tradition he has revived within the Republican Party that really traces his lineage back to the likes of Charles Lindbergh and the paleo-conservatives of the 1930s and the 1940s. But it is also a blow because of the choices that Europeans have made in the recent past. I mean, it's not like the writing hasn't been on the wall for quite some time. I mean, 2016 it was supposed to be the wake-up call. Europe got, a flurry of white papers on strategic autonomy and the need to step up. President Macron declared NATO brain dead in 2019. Then we got the Zeitenwende with the full-scale invasion in 2022. And again, that was supposed to be a game changer. I mean, I'm very much hoping that the vote yesterday has indeed been a game changer for Europeans, that they will step up and try to fill in the gaps, because the United States might not withdraw formally from NATO, but I think the commitment to bearing the brunt of the conventional deterrence burden in Eastern Europe, I think will be sort of moved onto the Europeans' shoulders sooner rather than later. I think the Baltic states and Poles and people who are kind of experiencing this firsthand are getting ready. But the problem is that without the defense industrial base of Germany and France, I mean, this region of Europe really lacks what some people would call strategic depth. And it's very difficult for these countries to sort of sustain their defenses on their own. Even, with Germany in the mix, it's not clear that sort of Europeans are up to the job of either, filling in the gap left by Americans if they don't continue to arm Ukraine, or actually being able to deter Russia on their own. All of this is a choice. Decline is a choice. In this case, Europe is, it's a wealthy continent despite the slow growth. And if Europeans had made different fiscal choices, they would not have been in this situation. And I'm wondering if, this does provide a reset to the conversation, or whether we'll be continuing on this path of a sort of steady decline that we've been on for quite some while. It's not that the counterfactual to Trump's election would have been brilliant. I mean, if you look at the sort of trends under the Biden administration in Eastern Europe, whether it's the de-democratization of places such as Georgia or indeed Hungary and Slovakia, the contested elections with massive Russian interference in places like Moldova, or Serbian revisionism, all of the indicators, I think, are pointing in the wrong direction, and the response from Brussels and European capitals and indeed Washington has been largely complacency. So I'm hoping this can break the complacency, but I don't think I would bet a farm on it.
Dalibor, thanks so much for your time and for coming in. I'm interested too, because of course you live and breathe in the think tank world in Washington, DC. To what degree do you think that think tanks, experts in this field have been prepared and preparing for this? Or do you think this will come as an earthquake?
I don't think it's been a completely unthinkable scenario. And unlike, I suppose, in Westminster, the think tank infrastructure and kind of the party resources and the campaign resources that are involved in staffing future administrations are massive. And so obviously Republicans have been thinking about the possibility of taking over there might be some very conventional Republicans who might be interested in serving again. There might also be, great number of representatives of the so-called new right who might try to kind of enter the scene. And if Vice President Vance is going to play a role in the staffing of the next administration, I think the balance of power will be tilted heavily in favor of those younger, more ruthless, perhaps, representatives of the new right. So this is not going to be like the first Trump term. I don't think it's going to be like a conventional Republican administration either. One of the ideas that President Trump came up with towards the end of his administration was the moving of a big part of civil service to the so-called Schedule F, which would enable him to basically use it for personal loyalty litmus tests and firing large numbers of civil servants. And if if that's what he wants to do in his fight against the deep state, we can very easily end up maybe not in an autocracy, but with a fairly dysfunctional federal government. I mean, the administration is complex, it's massive, and I don't think there is a sort of A team ready to take things over and have sort of constructive policy conversations. I'm not even sure what the sort of legislative agenda of a Republican bicameral majority would be at this point.
And it's interesting as well to see that we've got figures like Elon Musk involved. We've not mentioned him, but of course he'll be very familiar to listeners, not only because of his own prominence, but also because of his remarks and involvement in the war in Ukraine in various different guises. I wonder, what is the thread that joins somebody like Trump and Musk and Vance? Because in some ways you could say that they articulate very different strands of conservatism. There's identity politics that plays into it, of course, and that probably is the major thing that brings them together. But then you look at somebody like Musk, who is, of course, really very much a free trade believer, whereas Trump is advocating for tariffs. And then, of course, you've got their mutual stances on Ukraine, or skepticism on Ukraine, that unites them. But I wonder if you've got any thoughts on the connections between those parties and others.
So in the US, just like in the UK, parties are broad tents. So you have people who have fairly different views of the world kind of cohabiting together, and it hasn't been always easy, even within the sort of fusionist coalition of social conservatives, neoconservatives, sort of foreign policy hawks and libertarians. There have always been these tensions. I think those tensions are going to persist. I think what those three actors that you bring up share is a sort of more pugilistic view of politics that emphasizes the friend-enemy distinction, if you will, in politics, and that really sort of has been both a symptom and driver of polarization. It's not unlike in other countries where obviously right-of-center politics has gone in this direction. I think, though, that what distinguishes the American situation is the personality of Donald Trump and the sort of sense of unreality, the blending of entertainment and politics, and the absence of any sort of restraint in style and indeed in action. And I think that is going to put some stress on constitutional norms, on things like the civilian-military relationship, and does make me somewhat worried about the future of the democratic experiment in the United States.
Thank you. And just a couple more questions from me. You're also an expert on Eastern Europe, and indeed we've been reflecting on Eastern Europe, Moldova, of course Georgia of late. Now, this election result, of course, will have ramifications on those places, and interested in your perspective on that. But more broadly, how do you think countries in Eastern Europe, in the former Soviet bloc, react to the rather blasé attitude that you hear from senior Republicans regarding their freedoms, which in a sense America contributed to their victory for in the Cold War?
And these countries have agency, so I don't think they're going to sort of sit idly by and try to continue with business as usual. They will make arrangements for their own security. Some of them might involve working more closely with the United States. If you remember, Poland during the first Trump administration has maintained excellent relationship with the US, stepped up its own defenses. I mean, had pursued what I thought was really sort of an exemplary way of sort of coping with the sort of some of the stress that was posed on Eastern Europe by the Trump administration. You had on the other side of the spectrum Hungary, that even before Trump came to power has been kind of a cheerleader for the advent of a post-American world and for building bridges with the likes of China and Russia and Iran and so on and so forth. And to me, there'll be a sort of spectrum of responses. I think the rational response, especially from NATO allies, is to, again, take their security seriously, spend some real money, think about readiness. I mean, the sad truth is that NATO is not in a position to fully execute its operational plans as it stands now. So there are those gaps that need to be filled. But the fact is that the more transactional Washington becomes about its relationships and alliances, the less surprised Americans should be about countries kind of charting their own paths and behaving in ways that we might not like, whether it's nuclear proliferation, whether it's trying to assert themselves in their own neighborhood like Serbia is doing in Western Balkans, whether it's stealing elections like Georgian Dream has done. Today, Georgian Prime Minister said he was looking forward to a reset of the Georgian-US relationship, and he might very well get that, just not on terms that would be really conducive to US interest in the region. I mean, Georgian Dream is sort of vehicle for Russian and Chinese interests in Southern Caucasus and that part of the world. So I think we'll get a sort of greater cacophony of voices, and in the aggregate, I don't think the outcomes will be what American people necessarily asked for.
That's really, really interesting. And I think there's going to be an underappreciated aspect of all of this. And saying on that theme, Dalibor, are there any other thoughts that you have that are relevant to this that perhaps we haven't covered today? There's a lot of bases that we have talked about, but with your expertise, are there things that we should be thinking about that we're not?
One concern that I do have about the coming 4 years is that, unlike in the first Trump term, we might not be quite as lucky as to see our adversaries kind of tread carefully because of Trump's unpredictability and his supposedly violent outbursts. I mean, this sort of madman theory of deterrence that many Republicans sort of point to as the sort of model that the United States should be pursuing and will be pursuing under Trump, I think does have its weaknesses. Not having clear established red lines means that our adversaries can cross those red lines without realizing it. And also it makes it much harder for our allies to help us out, even if they're trying to help out in good faith. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, and it is possible that there was a sort of deterrent effect that Trump's unpredictability played in the first term. I'm not quite sure the outcomes will be on the net positive this time around.
Thanks, Dalibor. We're going to start moving towards the ends now. I think we've had about an hour. That's most people's breakfast or lunch hour or wherever you are. So move to final thoughts. Before we do, though, Dalibor, can I just ask one question, please? What do you think Putin's next move is going to be? It's one thing to all these allegations of election interference and what have you, and I think there's some credible allegations there, credible evidence. But be careful what you wish for. It's now happened. We now know what we got. Putin knows what he's dealing with. What's his next move?
So first of all, I'm not convinced by the claims that Russia played an important role in this election outcome. I mean, you could have made the argument in 2016, perhaps. I wasn't entirely convinced by it back then. But this time around, I mean, Trump won fair and square, won a popular majority, and I think everybody would be sort of best served if Democrats in particular just looked at their own shortcomings, weaknesses, and tried to sort of think about how to offer a more appealing platform to American voters. I think Putin does want Ukraine. At the same time, the cost of war has been quite significant. I'm not quite sure how long Russia can sort of sustain its current will to fight. And so if Trump offers a sort of off-ramp that involves Russia controlling a significant chunk of Ukraine and preventing Ukraine from joining NATO, preventing Ukraine from joining EU, perhaps as part of that package, Putin might very well take it. That does not address the longer-term challenge that Russia poses to European security and to Ukraine's future, but it allows Putin to consolidate, rebuild, and then test Western resolve again, whether in Ukraine or in other parts of Eastern Europe. I don't think, Medvedev, I think, was frank and sincere in saying that the goals of the special military operation remain unchanged, and I think we should take that seriously.
Coming up, we hear final thoughts. Okay, let's go to final thoughts. Francis, would you like to kick us off, please?
Well, thanks, Tom. A very short one from me today. If Europe doesn't arm itself in response to this election result and the threats therein, then appeasement, masquerading under another term, will be the inevitable order of the day. And to that, I say, to quote Churchill, an appeaser is one who feeds a crocodile, hoping it will eat him last. Beware.
Well said. Dalibor, please. Anything to leave our listeners with today?
I just say that I'm, an Eastern European in Washington. I'm an American by choice. And one reason why I'm an American by choice working for a right-of-center, traditionally conservative think tank is the intellectual appeal of the great sort of personalities of American conservatism, the Reagans and McCains and Bushes of the world. And I'm somewhat saddened by the fact that the Republican Party is no longer the same party that it was 20 years ago, but it is the new reality we have to deal with. And to me, the biggest challenge of the coming years is to sort of navigate the sheer policy uncertainty generated mainly by Trump's own persona rather than the sort of ideological shifts in that party. And I think that will greatly increase transaction costs for our allies in dealing with with the future American administration, but it does not mean the end of America-led alliances and hopefully not the end of the rules-based system, but we have to actually put some real money and resources into defending it.
Yeah, stand by, see what changes there are to the rules-based order. Adam, thanks for getting up early or staying up late, whichever, but thanks for joining us again. What would you like our listeners to be left with? What's your final thought?
Yeah, thanks. I enjoyed this, and Dalibor, I do remember you. It's good to be with you. And look, there's two things. So first off is how are the Democrats going to adjust to this loss? There's two possibilities. One, which I think would actually be successful, is recognize what the voters were out there saying, concerns about immigration, a demand to tack more to the center, that kind of stuff. Or is it going to be the AOCs and kind of the far left of the party that says, well, we didn't win because, we weren't frankly progressive enough. And so I think you're going to see a fight within the Democratic Party, a pretty serious fight, probably similar to what the Republican Party has dealt with, where Donald Trump won that battle. The other thing I'll say real quickly is, Joe Biden cannot point to any foreign policy wins. And I think his presidency, to be honest with you, will be seen as a failure on foreign policy unless he can spend this next couple months getting everything possible to Ukraine, give Ukraine the weapons they need, put them in the strongest position for an ultimately negotiated settlement. Jake Sullivan's got to get away from this fear of escalation. If Joe Biden and his administration can do that, maybe he can salvage some version of a decent foreign policy. But otherwise, I think he's on track to be seen as largely a failure in that.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Alexis Adimora. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.